Great. So, hi everyone. Welcome to the LSA's Thursday lunchtime talk series. I'm very pleased to be here with you all. My name is Maria McClintock. I'm an architecture curator and educator, but saliently work as professional programs producer here, or I should say virtually here at the LSA. I'm so pleased to be welcoming Sian Ricketts, who is project architect at CARMODY GROARKE. And just for a bit of context around the LSA's relationship with the practice, CARMODY GROARKE have been a long-standing member of our practice network. We have some founding cohort working in the studio, and they've been such a fantastic supporter of the school, both pedagogically and otherwise. So today's talk will be springboarding from this theme of materials and fabrication. These Thursday talks are part of our professional program, and they're building upon the school's ideal and commitment to collective peer development. And what our goal really is with these talks is that we take this kind of broad theme that is pertinent to the network, is pertinent to our students, and allow a member of the network to kind of springboard from this theme with a proposition or a project that is pertinent to the practice. And in light of that kind of collective peer development, we really hope that the students and practitioners and those from the wider built environment will see this as an opportunity to engage, exchange, and collaborate. So do ensure that you post questions for Sian in the Q&A box. And we'll also be publishing these talks on the LSA's YouTube channel. So we see them as this ongoing pedagogical resource. Now for an introduction to wonderful Sian. So as I mentioned, Sian is project architect at CARMODY GROARKE, has been with the studio since 2019. And building on her deep knowledge and interest in regenerative building design, Sian has played a crucial role in the development of sustainable strategies across the practice. And one such project, which Sian will get into in depth today, is the design of this lime and waste brick for the facade of a new wing at the Design Museum Ghent. And as well as the design and certification of the brick, Sian is also working on the redevelopment of the museum more generally. It's seeing this kind of significant extension to the historic site, and improving the presence of the building within the city more broadly. Sian is also project architect for the restoration of Power Hall, a vast Grade 2 listed former railway goods shed, which forms part of Manchester's Museum of Science and Industry. Sian's talk today is titled Rubbish Buildings, which in itself is quite a brilliant oxymoron, because if you've seen the extension to the Design Museum in Ghent, you'll know that it is anything but rubbish, but instead a very thoughtful and elegant contribution to the civic life of the city. So I'm so pleased to have Sian with us today. Again, do make sure you submit your questions for a wonderful speaker in the Q&A box, and I'll ensure that they make their way to Sian. So over to you, Sian.
Thank you so much. Okay, I'm going to share my screen and just double check everybody can see it. Thank you so much. That was a very nice introduction indeed. Of course, the window has disappeared that I want to share. Give me 1 second. There we go. Okay, I'll go full screen mode. Can everybody see that? Yeah, I can't see anyone. So
I
yeah,
just realized that.
just fab. Okay. Yeah, so thank you very much. Thank you so much for inviting me to talk about this project. So as Maria said, yeah, rubbish buildings. Buildings that are made out of rubbish rather than buildings that are rubbish, we hope, is the title of this afternoon's talk. So we're CARMODY GROARKE. We are currently about 35-ish people. We've just employed a handful of extra people because we've got some new work coming in, which is fantastic. We operate out of an office in Farringdon. And I guess we're most known for, well, we work on a range of different projects, some commercial work, mostly kind of cultural buildings. I guess the Hill House box over here on the right-hand side, some of you might be familiar with. Maria mentioned the Museum of Science and Industry in Manchester. So this is a part of that project that was recently finished, a new museum, an exhibition space within that. We work internationally as well. So this is one of our projects in Hamburg in Germany, and of course the Design Museum Ghent here. So our kind of projects vary in scale quite a lot, right through from some relatively small kind of small scale work. For example, we're working at the Dulwich Picture Gallery on a new children's centre, which is a really nice scale, right up to sort of these quite big projects. So we're currently working developing a new archive for the British Library at Boston Spa, and that's got a kind of contract value of around £95 million. So we're working on across quite a broad scale at the moment. So I'm going to talk to you about bricks. We've got a kind of typical brick here on the left-hand side of the screen, and then a different brick here on the right-hand side. I probably don't need to say this, but we are operating at a time when we're all kind of acutely aware of the climate crisis that is kind of, it falls in and out of focus in media on the news, but it is still an issue, even if our politicians fail to talk about it. We know that the building and construction industry is responsible for 40% of global CO2 emissions, so it's absolutely vast. The average UK citizen produces around 10 tonnes of CO2e per annum, so that's that little tiny dot there. And if you compare that to, say, the scale of a kind of medium-sized cultural building, it will be producing around 6,000 tonnes of CO2e in production. So all of that is just to very briefly illustrate that the professional impact that we have as architects and as kind of budding architects is really vast. And I think what we're really seeing is that kind of with that responsibility towards our built environment, there's scope for opportunities as well. So as I said, we'll be talking about bricks. The kind of production of materials in general, just kind of zooming out for a second, we're very used to our materials that we make our buildings with having been produced, or at least the kind of the production of them that we're familiar with at the moment is kind of born out of a period of mass production at a time of really cheap energy. So the 20th century when stuff was cheap. Equally, the regulations, both in terms of the production and the performance of those materials, is also kind of shaped by the fact that they've been developed at a time of really cheap and prolific energy as well. And I think that's quite key to kind of frame the backdrop of the conversation this afternoon. And that's kind of enabled us, us collectively as an industry, but also us as kind of CARMODY GROARKE, to be producing buildings that we might not produce now in terms of the materials that are used. So this is a private house in Highgate. I guess the question is, how do we want to be operating? Do we want to be the people that play golf in front of the forest fires? Probably not. And then against that backdrop, what do we want our buildings to look like? I think something that we've thought a lot about in practice is, how do you design kind of sustainable buildings without falling into these sort of environmental cliches and kind of greenwashing? I really think earth ships are amazingly cool, but I think that there's a kind of aesthetic there, and we don't necessarily want all of our buildings to fall into a kind of cliched aesthetic of what sustainable or regenerative or low carbon design looks like. So we developed this brick, and we developed it for use as facade material on our project at the Design Museum in Ghent, as Maria said. Just to give you a bit of background on that project. So Ghent, which is the capital city of Flanders in northern Belgium, is a really, really beautiful historic city. It's only 3 hours away on the Eurostar, so recommend that everybody goes and drinks some nice Belgian beer there. And the city developed out of quite prolific cloth industry in the kind of medieval times. The Design Museum itself houses a collection dating back from the 14th century all the way through to kind of contemporary designers that we might recognize. So this is a Muller van Severen piece, and it houses a really vast collection of Flemish design, and indeed other international design as well, but primarily focused on Flemish design. The city then, so the site, this white outline here just kind of shows the extent of the site, and the project is filling this kind of empty space. The Design Museum is situated around a courtyard here. There's an old historic house, Huisleiten, that forms one side of the courtyard, and a former hotel called Hotel de Kunik that forms another side. This large extension that was completed in 1992 that forms the other side, and then we've got this sort of empty space here, right in the center of the city. The city's got, I think it's 3 UNESCO World Heritage Sites, and the museum sits within the kind of buffer zone of these UNESCO World Heritage Sites. There's also a medieval castle in the background there. So it's a really sensitive site. It's a really beautiful site, and it's a really interesting sort of brief in terms of infilling this this empty space that has existed on the museum site for a number of years. So there is our proposal. So we won this project through competition back in 2019, and then we've been working on it ever since. And actually, we were lucky enough to go to site on Monday at the beginning of this week, where they broke ground. So the demolition has started, and it's due to be complete in 2026. So this is then the facade. Just bring it back to the brick then. So we thought really hard about what the external material of this building should be made out of. There's a really long tradition of using brick within Flanders, and so it therefore felt very, very appropriate for the use on the Design Museum. We also knew that we wanted it to be a white brick. There's a tradition of the most important buildings and civic buildings within the city of Ghent being white. So we felt quite strongly that the museum needed to kind of sit within that kind of typology, that collection of buildings, and therefore it needed to be white. We also had ideas about how we wanted the museum to be read at sort of different scales. So at the scale of the city, it was about the building existing as a sort of monolith within the city. At the street scale, we wanted the facade and the building to be sort of intriguing, so with an interesting articulated facade in terms of its in terms of the sort of detailing, and also this this window that you can see right into and see all the way through the museum into that courtyard. And then at the scale of the person or the hand, the facade and the materiality of the facade, it needed to represent the kind of ethos of the museum, in so much as it's a museum of design. So we wanted something to be crafted, we wanted something to be you know, perhaps bespoke, and indeed innovative as well. So we developed this brick, and I think it's just worth touching on or indeed maybe I should step back and say we decided brick was the most appropriate choice, but then if we just kind of think about what that means in terms of sort of carbon and sustainability, we know that typical brick production is a sort of highly energy intensive process. There's over 1,500 billion bricks that are produced globally each year, and often that is done in really efficient coal-fired kilns, and bricks are responsible for over 20% of global black carbon. Now, black carbon is like the worst type of carbon that industries can emit, so it's really bad for the environment. We also know that a demand for kind of cheap materials really fuels kind of unethical labour practices. So off the back of all of that, we wanted to we started asking ourselves, well, we know that we want this building to be clad in brick, but is there a better way of doing it? Just looking then at kind of typical brick production. So your typical clay brick is made out of a binder, which is clay, a silicate, which is sand, so that's acting as the aggregate, and that is fired, and then you get your fired clay brick. It's fired at high temperature, and that has a very high energy demand on it. So we produced a lime waste brick, and we use lime as a binder instead of clay. We substitute kind of virgin materials for construction and industrial waste, which is still a silicate. So it still acts in the same kind of performance way, but it's from waste streams. And lime cures in atmospheric CO2, and therefore, rather than fire the bricks, they are carbonated in atmospheric CO2, and actually in doing so, that process kind of sequesters CO2 from the air, and that's where we get our cured lime waste brick. There's a bit of chemistry involved. I'm not a chemist, but we did have to learn a little bit in order to go through this this process. And so just kind of looking at the way that the how we've managed to kind of reduce the carbon of that brick. We do that both through the materials that are used and also the process for the production of the brick. So just looking at materials briefly, we've been actively avoiding certain materials, particularly virgin clay and virgin sand. So in order to get a white brick, which, as I said, we felt was appropriate for this building, much of the supplies of white clay are from China, and therefore there's obviously like vast transportation needed in that. And virgin sand, there's actually a global shortage of sand, which is pretty amazing when you think about how abundant it is. But the type of sand that's used in the construction industry, it's often dredged from riverbanks, and it's causing all sorts of havoc to kind of watercourses and impacting flooding, and you know there's a real issue with sand. So how can we avoid that? In terms of using lime, I think it's worth just looking very briefly at lime. So lime is produced from firing limestone, which is obviously a kind of high carbon process in itself. However, there's a whole kind of spectrum in where lime sits. So we're using lime at sort of this end of the spectrum. So the limestone is fired at a relatively low temperature, and therefore there's certain characteristics that as a result of that. If we're looking at lime, which is used in kind of cement and the production of cementitious materials, you're looking at firing a much higher temperature. So that's just a very brief overview on that. And then in terms of the recycled silicates, we're using waste brick, waste concrete, and waste glass, all of which are kind of readily available within the sort of local area to Ghent. The interesting thing about it is also that when you start using these waste materials, you can actually benefit from the material sort of processes that they've already undergone. So a pozzolan it sort of acts as an additional binding mechanism within materials. And what we were finding is that by using things like concrete that has already kind of cured and already gone through that process, so waste concrete, we can then benefit from the kind of binding characteristics of those materials as well. So there's a kind of double advantage to using waste streams. And as I said, we were able to source all of these materials from within an 8-kilometer radius of the Design Museum. So Ivago and Demol are some of the kind of largest waste processing facilities within the city. Then if we just look very briefly at the process, The process that we're using is a much kind of more handmade, bespoke kind of production than your sort of typical mass production of bricks. So we are able to take a kind of crusher to the waste production facilities and do some of that processing actually on site there. The materials will then get put in this kind of vat, and then they go through a compressing machine. Interestingly, the compressor, it sort of has this silo at the top, and the materials go into it. So this is silo over here. The materials get put into it, and it comes out as beautiful bricks like that. Now, this machine can sit on the back of a truck, which means that it can be moved around to various sites, which gives us a lot of flexibility in terms of where the actual production of the brick is going to be made. And there we go, there's a kind of close up. They come out as these like quite grey blocks, and then as the lime goes through the process of carbonating, they get much, much paler. And all of that has resulted in us being able to produce a brick for use on this building, which is about 1/3 of the embodied carbon of a kind of typical clay brick. And it looks a bit like this. That's it in the sun when it's dried out. And I think it's quite nice because you can see the sort of aggregates and bits of waste actually within the brick. And then kind of alongside that is there's quite a beautiful narrative there. What we've done is we've taken the waste from the city of Ghent, we've turned it into a brick, and that brick is then used for the facade of the museum for the city of Ghent. So in terms of kind of selling that narrative, in terms of taking our clients, our funders, and indeed the citizens of the city of Ghent on this kind of journey into a sort of getting positive feedback on the museum, that this has been a kind of really critical part of it. It's the circularity of it, and it's about saying, it's about kind of revaluing materials, so giving waste a kind of added value by turning it into something beautiful. So good things only happen through teamwork and collaboration, and this is something I particularly wanted to touch on, because we haven't been doing this. You know, we're architects, we're not brick manufacturers, and we're not even particularly kind of material specialists in a very, very sort of focused way. In that we've been drawing on other people's specialisms as well. So we worked very closely with Local Works Studio, who are based in Sussex, and we also worked very closely with BC Materials, who are based in Brussels. And that's been a really, really critical part of this process. It is absolutely a collaborative process that couldn't have happened without these other people involved. So we started the process with Local Works back in 2020. Right, sort of working through lockdown and looking at different materials available. So I don't know if many of you are familiar with Local Works, but you should definitely check them out. They're doing some really interesting stuff with all sorts of different waste streams. This in particular is a vat of kind of oyster shells, hence the face, because it was really, really smelly. And then, yeah, working with BC, then there's kind of specialists within the field of rammed earth construction, and we were able to draw on their expertise, both in terms of production of bricks, but also they're based in Brussels, so they know lots and lots about the standards and about the legislation in Belgium, and that was really critical in getting this over the line. We made multiple different tests and prototypes. So I think there's like 20 different versions of the brick there. And we were testing them against different things. So aesthetics, but also performance. So for example, this is a brick with kind of limited size of aggregate. So it's quite small. This brick, you can just about make out there's a kind of green and brown glass in there. This is actually the waste from bars and restaurants in Ghent, and those are kind of beer bottles and things that you can see as the aggregate. Interestingly, we couldn't go forward with this one because the sugars, the residual sugars from the alcohol content that were on the beer meant that the lime and the lime couldn't kind of get a good bite on the aggregate because it was kind of too slidey because of the glucose residuals. So yeah, but it's just quite nice to have been able to test all of these different options. So there's a test table which just shows you kind of what we were doing and the different versions. And we went through first a kind of preliminary tests in terms of compressive strength, where we basically went to this great manufacturing facility and took loads of bricks and crushed them under immense pressure, which was good fun, resulting in things like that. And then we were able to kind of refine the recipe to the point that we've got a brick that now works. So the ratio of lime to waste is about 1 to 3. So the brick is made out of 63% recycled municipal waste, 18% binder, and 19% of other fine aggregates. So then, Donald Trump just arriving on my presentation seems a bit random, but this is to say that one of the real challenges of getting this done is to kind of cut through the red tape. How do we kind of get these innovative new materials? How do we get them to be able to be used on buildings? And that's the kind of second challenge of this, I suppose. The first challenge was the actual production. The second thing is like, how do you make it happen? How do you slice through the Eurocodes in order to be able to demonstrate that it's fit for purpose when there are actually no kind of specific standards or codes against it? We've got lots of experience in building with innovative materials and sort of not necessarily highly regulated techniques, but which kind of works when they are temporary or indeed kind of private buildings. However, when you're building a new museum for the city of Ghent, you obviously need to be able to demonstrate that the materials are fit for purpose. So we worked very closely with BUTGB, who are the Belgium Board for Technical Design and Construction, and we had lots and lots of meetings with them, kind of navigating and negotiating the tests in which we would measure the brick against. And they also are going to be very, very present during the production of the bricks. So this is this guy here with his clipboard, and he's literally just checking that what we're saying is going into the bricks is indeed going into the bricks. One of the first ways we started through sort of navigating, as I say, these standards and these Eurocodes was about making comparisons to, is there anything similar that is in production at the moment? The most, from a kind of chemical point of view, the most similar brick is a calcium silicate block. The distinct in that it's a lime-based binder and it uses natural silicous materials as the aggregate. The real difference is the fact that calcium silicate blocks tend to be autoclaved, which is where they kind of go through this sort of long steam oven. And our bricks are going to be dried in just in air dried. And therefore, we were not able to use the sort of standards from a calcium silicate block against our waste brick because the process is different. So yeah, as I said, we kind of went through various different conversations with the BUTGB, and we were able to kind of formulate a kind of table of tests in which we would then look at the performance of our brick and make sure it kind of was fit for purpose. So we've got clay brick Mystique, which is a sort of off-the-shelf brick that you can go and buy and go, probably not from Travis Perkins, but somewhere else you can buy it kind of off the shelf, as it were. And we've got calcium silicate blocks and then the lime waste brick. And it's interesting just to look at the kind of performance metrics and how the brick is performing. It's pretty comparable. The only difference really is when we look at kind of freeze thaw and moisture movement, and that is something that we're working through. at the moment with facade engineers on the project in order to make sure that, particularly with moisture movement, to make sure that as the brick kind of expands and contracts, as it may do, more so than say a kind of clay-fired brick, that the detailing around the building is able to cope with that and facilitate it. Freeze thaw is also quite an interesting one. So typically you would need your bricks to meet an F2 standard in terms of exposure class. We were meeting F1 very, very easily. We had to refine the recipe a little bit in order to meet F2, although again, kind of interestingly, F2 wasn't it was a kind of client imposed regulation rather than a standard that we absolutely had to meet. And I think this is where our thinking sort of started changing and evolving with respect to the brick, because actually what we learned through sort of interrogating this particular standard was that in terms of kind of building detailing, you can begin to build out the necessity for a very onerous building performance metric. So this is just taken from the British standards, and what it's basically saying is that you've got these various classes of exposure from protected to severe, and you need to be providing a material that meets the necessary standard. However, if you start to introduce kind of bespoke or targeted detailing, then you can then reduce the necessary performance standard of the materials used. So when you start to introduce a parapet, when you start to introduce a sill, you can actually use, let's say, a softer material that doesn't need to be so kind of durable. And that got us really thinking, if for example, our client were not saying, as I said, it was client imposed, if they were saying we don't need to meet the F2 standard, we could have got away with potentially using a kind of more feeble lime, so one that exists further down that spectrum that I showed earlier, and therefore that wouldn't have needed to be fired at such a high temperature, and therefore you're then improving you're using less energy in order to produce it. So that was quite interesting. And actually in the UK, they don't have it in Belgium, which is part of the challenge. We weren't able to demonstrate that in Belgium, but in the UK, we've got very good data on exposure classes. So if we were to say do this project again in the UK or something similar, we'd really be able to target how the materials used relative to its location, and therefore target the detailing accordingly. As we kind of developed the design, we recognized the need to be sort of protecting the building. So we started to introduce kind of more articulation onto the facade. We were looking at, we've introduced these kind of very deep window sills, and also a parapet at the top, which really protects the most exposed areas of the building. So this is a kind of early render versus later render on the project. And we were looking at, say, the detailing from sort of earth construction in particular, and kind of taking our cues from there in terms of exaggerating this detailing. It's not particularly new. We know that kind of vernacular design and therefore the associated detailing has existed for years and years. And I think something that we've sort of thought more and more about is that we need to kind of be looking back to look forward, in so much as just coming back to that quote at the beginning about about materials being produced at a time of abundant energy. That meant we could be making materials that are super, super durable and not actually questioning whether they need to be that durable. I think against the backdrop of finite resources and the fact that we need to be addressing how we're producing materials, we can be arguably using sort of softer materials that are less onerous on the environment and making sure that we adapt our detailing accordingly. There's the brick again, and yeah, so all of this is to say, like, where do we go from here? What have we learned? What does a potentially new sustainable vernacular look like, and how do we kind of accommodate that within the building industry and within kind of standards? What we found ourselves being very limited by is actually the current building regs and standards that exist. And I think looking forward, what we really want to be able to be demanding from a government, from kind of legislative, from legislation, is that we can perhaps be looking at a kind of new sustainable vernacular and taking on board some of these kind of lessons learnt, and yeah, thinking about kind of buildings and detailing quite differently looking forward. And I think from the perspective of CARMODY GROARKE, this process, this kind of research into the brick has really kind of catalyzed our thinking in that sense. And that's the end. I don't know what time it is. I don't know how quickly I did that. Oh, there we go, 40 minutes, that's about all right.
Thank you so much for that, Sian. That was just such a, such a fascinating presentation and case study, but I really have to praise you for the range of visual culture that you managed to introduce there, from Breaking Bad to Donald Trump, and that image of the raging fire behind the golf course, I think, is gonna haunt me forever.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's such an interesting presentation. I guess just to begin, I'm really interested in a point that you made early on in the talk about, you kind of touched on notions of efficiency, and I'm really interested in the kind of often tense relationship that can exist between, in very big parentheses, sustainability and efficiency. And what I found so fascinating about your talk is the aspects of the development of this brick was quite haptic, and there's a lot of kind of craft and sort of traditional methods, again in parentheses, that underpin the production of it. But I'm just interested to hear your thoughts about, that intersection that can exist, or the often tense binary that can exist between sustainability and efficiency.
I mean, it's a huge challenge, and I think what we've found, and I'm sure we will continue to do so, is there's a kind of reluctance to people are often scared of the new. Contractors won't necessarily want to build with something they're unfamiliar with, we've had to work really hard with in kind of weaving this material into the specification, for example. And we've had lots and lots of conversations with the contractor who's now on site about, this isn't going to be this kind of quick kind of process of building necessarily with this brick. It will need perhaps more time and a bit more patience towards it. But I think the way to navigate that and is almost through kind of storytelling and taking people on the journey with you. I mentioned before when we were first talking, Maria, about taking the client with us on this journey, and that's been a really kind of key part of navigating what are otherwise just really difficult obstacles. You need to sort of bring people with you, and I don't want to use the word convince, because that's not quite the right word, or indeed even persuade, but you need to take people on that journey so that we're all doing it together for the greater good. And therefore I think that's when people can be more forgiving towards if demands of efficiencies and sort of conventional techniques. We can kind of look beyond conventional techniques. Does that answer?
For sure, and I think it raises really interesting questions around regulation as well that you touched on, and I think particularly maybe for some of the students on the call, there's been this huge call to arms since COP in Glasgow around embodied carbon, particularly from the Architects Climate Action Network, kind of calling for greater regulation around embodied carbon in the UK. And I'm interested to know what's happening in Ghent, or what your kind of perspectives or position is on that aspect of the building project.
Yeah, so we were lucky enough to receive 100,000 euros of funding to help, and that was from Circular Flanders, which is a kind of quite big governmental body that operates in Flanders, and that was really to develop this. It was the client that actually secured that funding. We didn't necessarily know where it was going to start with, but that is to say that when you have things like that available, that then allows stuff like this to happen. I'd say on the whole, circularity is quite a big thing in Belgium, perhaps more so than in the UK, and their infrastructure, I would say, is a little bit more set up for it. So in terms of procuring the waste for the brick, it was a relatively easy process. We literally went to Ivago, who are the kind of waste, what's the word, kind of waste production guys, although production is not quite the right word, processing people, and we were able to go, and we were literally able to kind of take the waste off from them in a sort of fairly unregulated way. We haven't tried to do that in the UK yet, but I kind of get a hunch that it's more difficult, that there's more red tape, that there's more barriers in the UK. I would say Belgium's quite well set up for it.
Interesting. I worked with a designer who extracting oil from kitchens and turning that waste into some kind of new form of energy. But yeah, those projects are sort of, you don't hear about them so much here in the UK.
Yeah,
I think we have certain types of red tape, but that really differ from mainland Europe.
yeah, absolutely. The other thing that was quite key in all of this was it was to do with the kind of, because it's a public building, actually a lot of the money for funding went on making sure that we could get sort of almost having a legal team involved in making sure that we could actually use the brick. Typically you need to have 3 options of procurement for public buildings in Belgium, and obviously this is a unique and bespoke brick, so we needed to be able to kind of negotiate the kind of legal framework of procurement on public buildings, which a lot of that funding went towards.
Yeah, we have next week, we'll have Mandeep Singh Kalra from the first architects talking about policy. And yeah, I think we're really interested in those sorts of multidisciplinary relationships that often go overlooked, or the kind of many stakeholders involved in projects of nature. Was there anything else I'm interested in how you found all of these different incredibly specialized parties to collaborate on the project with you, what that sort of process of collaboration looked like for the project?
Yeah, I mean, I would say it started quite in almost quite a naive way. It was myself and my colleague going down to talk with Ben from Local Work Studio and looking at all the amazing things that they're doing with waste streams, and sort of saying, well, can we turn this into a brick? Can we make it this color? Can we, can we use this sort of waste stream? And calling up the architect. So we're working with Trans Architecture in Ghent. They're our partner architects on this project. Literally asking the project architect on that side to go to an excavation site, fill a Tupperware, well, fill a big plastic box full of excavation waste and get it shipped over to the UK. It's this kind of, it was these sort of funny requests that we were doing in order to kind of get momentum, and then from that, Ben was able to produce these kind of first prototype bricks that we then were able to show to the client. We were saying, like, look at what you can do, like, isn't this cool? And then from there, we did recognise the need to have a kind of foot on the ground in Belgium, which is where BC Materials became involved. And they're amazing. They're absolute experts in their fields. And we presented them with, this is what we've done to date. This is where we think it could go. Can you help us? And they really ran with it. And all credit to them for having kind of taken on something that isn't particularly within their sort of business model, and doing that and being able to kind of push it forward. And they also, as I say, they brought lots and lots of knowledge of kind of Belgium building regulations and test regimes. So it was sort of a happy marriage of lots of different parties that kind of came together and that enabled it to happen, which was critical to the success of it.
Amazing. We've got some really interesting questions from the audience. So I think I will start fielding them to you, Sian. From Lyndall, did you have to pay to use the waste? And how do you ensure consistency between batches?
We're not paying for the waste, no. In terms of consistency, so everything gets graded. So when you go to the kind of waste supplier, and you take it, it then goes through a process of being kind of crushed and ground, and then it's graded into different kind of sizes of aggregates. So varies from 0.3 mil to 0.6 mil, 0.6 mil to 10 mil, and so that's where you get your consistency, by you kind of take it and you grade it. But that's also where I mentioned BTGB are involved. They are looking at making sure that that everything that we're kind of taking in does have a consistency to it, and that we're avoiding, nasty, noxious, toxic chemicals within the waste. And they're kind of keeping an eye on all of that process. Yeah.
I feel like you could open a kind of public library of bricks with all this taxonomizing that you're doing for the project. Another question, how did you reassure the client in terms of warranties? Interesting question.
Yeah, so this is where BETGB have been heavily involved. What they've been able to do is provide us with a certificate that demonstrates that the brick is fit for purpose, and we've been able to do that by, as I said in the talk, we developed a kind of test table which takes various different tests from various different standards, and in doing so you sort of create this bespoke test table that says, well, look, we've measured it against this, and this, it's performed this well, it's kind of passed, and therefore it's equivalent to other bricks. In terms of kind of liabilities and stuff, it's a kind of complex set of I'm not quite sure of the right word, but it's come through being able to kind of demonstrate its performance, and BETGB are able to kind of put their name against that.
Fantastic. And how did the cost per brick compare with standard brick costs?
So we've always it is a civic building, it's a museum, and therefore we would expect to be using a facade material that kind of sits within the medium to high range of cost if we were to say buy a brick off the shelf. So notwithstanding the research, because that's come through the grant from Circular Flanders, but the actual brick is comparable against the cost of a sort of standard nice brick that you would expect to use on this type of building.
Yeah, I really enjoyed is maybe not the correct word, but that at the beginning of your talk you addressed the kind of birth of mass production and modernism, and the fact that this the site through which these bricks first kind of see the light of day houses this, I don't know, this kind of vast repository of modernity. And I was wondering, oh, maybe the collection should accession one of your bricks and kind of display it as a sort of call to arms about how to do things differently. Did you use a different kind of mortar to go alongside the brick?
That's a really good point. I mean, we need to be looking at this as a sort of whole facade rather than just an individual brick. And indeed, we're producing a bespoke mortar that is similar in terms of its kind of recipe to the brick. So it's a lime-based mortar that uses a kind of recycled aggregates as well. The critical thing with bricks is obviously that you need to make sure your mortar is softer than the brick itself, so that when you get the instances of movement and stuff, which we inevitably will, it's the mortar that sort of fails rather than the brick.
Right. Brilliant. Okay, and we have another question. Hi, Sean. I'm not sure who this is from because I can only see direct messages from the LSA, but thanks for the presentation. Do you think that much of the research and code interpretation work you and your team have done would facilitate the production of a similar brick from waste in the UK? I'm interested in the replicability of this model and whether the work that's been done would translate to another policy environment.
I mean, I think it would, yeah. We've become quite good at interpreting the kind of codes and standards. We haven't tried to do it in the UK, so in terms of the kind of obstacles that you have to navigate, in terms of the hoops you have to jump through, we're not yet sure. We are actually doing some research through the Future Observatory at the Design Museum here in London, which is kind of geared towards looking at how we can potentially do something similar in the UK, albeit with a slightly different binder. So I think there's lots of lessons learnt from the process in Belgium. It wouldn't be completely applicable because it's kind of different set of legislation.
Yeah, I did think about the Future Observatory. It's my old stomping ground, as you were.
Oh, is it? Okay.
Yeah. Well, Design Museum.
Yeah.
But that institution, which for those that don't know, is this kind of a new institution based at the Design Museum, who I believe are committed to net zero projects or reaching net zero by 2030. So it's really exciting that you're there and you're involved in, and also really celebrate kind of multidisciplinarity as well. And I think on that point of research, there's just so much in that, and Wolfgang has commented, thank you for this interesting insight of a necessary kind of building for the future. How public is all of this thinking? It feels like this could be a kind of studio course in and of itself at an architecture school. Is there a plan to make some of this thinking and all of the knowledges that you've accrued over this process public in some way, or available to the sector in some way?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. We've obviously written about it in the AJ specification article that that myself and my colleague Neil wrote, and I think we would like to expand upon the research within practice and kind of continue that. And exactly how that manifests, I'm not quite sure yet. We'll be sort of, we'll have to see. But I think along, you know, it's not kind of concluded yet, because the bricks have still got to be produced and then indeed used on the project. So I think what's really exciting is that we will actually have a project with this brick, which is like, yeah, that's the most exciting aspect of it. How we kind of then bring all of that together and I don't know, turn it into kind of a springboard for more research. We're not quite sure yet.
Yeah, I was thinking of the Cork House.
Mm.
I'm not sure if you've come across that project, which I think came out of a kind of Bartlett studio, Matthew Barnett Howland, Dido Milne, and
Yeah.
Oliver Wilton, and just how that kind of this idea of a new sustainable vernacular and how that could kind of feed into an architectural education or a new approach to education. I'm not sure how much of that you've thought about in terms of where that thinking or where these processes could begin.
I mean, I think we love talking about it. Evidently, we love kind of sharing it in these sorts of forums. We've also been going around quite a lot of engineering firms and talking to them about it, because so we gave a presentation to Price and Myers and also Structure Workshop relatively recently on this, because it's really interesting to also hear like different perspectives, and you know, particularly structural engineers can bring a lot of interesting conversation with respect to the sort of buildability of new materials. Also working closely with AKT2 on the design enterprise partnership that I mentioned at the Design Museum. So we like being kind of generous with our knowledge, I suppose, and sharing it, and hopefully inspiring new you know, other kind of similar processes, and indeed yeah, talking to students is a kind of key part of that.
We love to hear that at the LSA. I think it's really, really exciting. Another lovely comment from Wolfgang. I would like to put a hint of this kind of thinking from Professor Werner Sobeck. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. He has formulated 17 theses on the subject of sustainability. So thank you for that tip, Wolfgang. I think that's all of the questions we have from the audience, and we are just approaching the hour. So I just wanted to say on behalf of everyone, thank you so much again to Sean for such a rich presentation this afternoon. There's so much knowledge there and so much to take away. And I'm just really excited to see how this this develops as a kind of framework or a model moving forward. So thank you very much for sharing your brilliant brains with us over lunch today.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. And just a reminder, next Thursday, I think is the 1st of June, we have another lunchtime talk, as I mentioned, with Be First. We're delighted to have one of Be First's directors, Amandeep, joining us, talking about the very complex and knotty processes that underpin policy and regeneration projects, specifically in Barking and Dagenham. So really looking forward to that. Thank you for joining us today, and I hope you have a lovely afternoon. Hopefully see you next week.
Thanks so much.
Bye.
Bye-bye.